In the heart of an elite San Francisco neighborhood, Judge Helena Price and her husband, Aaron Brooks, a federal agent, are celebrating their wedding surrounded by loved ones. But their joy is shattered when a single phone call from an elderly neighbor, fueled by long-held biases, brings the police to their door. What begins as a routine noise complaint escalates into an evening of intimidation, aggression, and wrongful detentions as officers push their authority too far. As Helena and Aaron are forced to defend their guests and themselves, they realize they're confronting a power structure much darker than they ever imagined. Determined to seek justice, they embark on a fight that will test their strength, uncover layers of corruption in their community, and expose the very system Helena once trusted. Shadows over Golden Gate is a powerful tale of resilience and courage, revealing how a single night can shatter illusions and ignite a movement for change. The warm glow of string lights hung over Helena and Aaron's backyard, casting a golden hue over the celebration. Guests filled the space with laughter, toasts, and shared memories, creating a tapestry of love and unity. Helena, radiant in her ivory dress, clinked glasses with her childhood friend. "You did it, Helena," her friend laughed. "A judge and a newlywed. Is there anything you can't do?" Helena chuckled. "I'm just grateful I found someone willing to put up with me." Nearby, Aaron was deep in conversation with his uncle, who had just finished a toast. "You make her happy, Aaron," he said with a proud smile. "It's all any of us could ask for." Aaron placed a hand on his uncle's shoulder, glancing toward Helena. "She makes me the better version of myself," he said quietly. They shared a warm look across the crowd, a silent promise of the life they were building together. A few doors down, Agnes Hathaway peered through her lace curtains, her sharp gaze fixated on the backyard filled with guests. She wrinkled her nose as a loud cheer went up when Helena and Aaron started their first dance. "Ridiculous," Agnes muttered, her voice tight with disdain. The neighborhood's never been this noisy. The music drifted through her window, mingling with laughter and the occasional clink of glasses. Agnes saw guests she didn't recognize, people who looked out of place in her neighborhood, and her annoyance grew. She reached for her phone, dialing the familiar number of the police. "Hello? Yes," she began, affecting a worried tone. "There's a loud gathering in my neighborhood. It's gotten out of hand, and I think I saw some suspicious behavior. Could you send someone to check?" As she hung up, a sense of satisfaction settled over her. That should quiet things down. At the precinct, the dispatcher relayed the call, catching the attention of a group of officers on an otherwise slow night. "A disturbance in Oak Hill? Fancy neighborhood," one officer noted, smirking. "Nothing better to do on a Tuesday night?" They exchanged knowing glances. Soon, 3 squad cars rolled out, lights flashing, engines revving as they approached the Price's address. Back at the house, Aaron noticed the subtle shift as the police cars parked just outside the gate. He caught Helena's eye as murmurs started spreading through the crowd. "Why are there police here?" a guest asked quietly, glancing around nervously. Helena frowned, her instincts as a judge kicking in. "I don't know," she replied, moving closer to the gate. "But I'll find out." Aaron joined her, his arm a reassuring presence as they walked together. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, met them as they reached the entrance. "Good evening, officer," Helena said, her tone calm and professional. "Is there a problem?" "We received a complaint about a disturbance," the officer replied, looking past her at the gathering. "Loud noise, suspicious activity." Helena's brow furrowed. "Officer, this is a private celebration. We're well within noise limits, and I assure you, nothing suspicious is happening here." The officer's gaze didn't waver. "We're still going to need to investigate," he insisted, motioning to his colleagues, who began to move toward the crowd. Helena's jaw clenched. "I'm a judge," she stated firmly, "and as the homeowner, I'm telling you this gathering is entirely lawful." The officer's mouth set in a tight line. "Ma'am, we have a job to do, judge or not." Helena glanced at Aaron, her hand tightening around his. "Let's keep this peaceful," she whispered. But she could see a new tension building in Aaron's eyes, one she hadn't seen before. Back in the yard, guests started whispering, their cheerful expressions replaced with worry as the officers spread out, casting suspicious glances at everyone. Aaron's younger cousin tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, why are the police here?" "It's okay, son," he replied, though his tone betrayed uncertainty. Helena raised her voice, trying to address both the officers and the crowd. "Everyone, please stay calm. Officers, I don't believe you have grounds to interfere here." The lead officer stepped closer, his posture growing confrontational. "We received a complaint, and we'll decide if there's cause," he replied brusquely. Aaron, standing tall beside Helena, spoke in a steady tone. "With respect, officer, we're more than willing to cooperate, but you're treading on private property. Surely we can handle this civilly." Another officer, moving through the guests, asked a young man to provide identification. The guest, visibly shaken, fumbled with his wallet. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, glancing over at Helena and Aaron. The lead officer's voice grew colder. "Ma'am, you'll need to step aside and let us do our job. This is our jurisdiction now." Helena's calm demeanor began to crack. "Your jurisdiction does not overrule citizens' rights. I would ask that you respect that." The officer's gaze hardened. "Ma'am, we've been more than patient. Let us handle the disturbance, or you may find yourself facing consequences." The crowd had grown silent, watching in disbelief. Helena and Aaron exchanged a glance, both reading the rising tension in each other's faces. This was not the quiet, joyful night they'd planned, and it was clear things were only beginning to spiral. The backyard, once a cozy haven filled with laughter, had turned tense as officers moved through the crowd, their eyes scanning everyone with suspicion. Guests clutched their glasses or wrapped arms around each other, unsure of what to expect next. Aaron's family, gathered in small clusters, exchanged uneasy glances, while Helena's friends looked to her with nervous hope that she could resolve this. Helena approached the lead officer. "Sir, if it's truly necessary to question our guests, I ask that you at least treat them with respect." The officer barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, we're here to handle a complaint, not to take requests." Another officer approached an elderly relative of Helena's, asking sharply, "Identification?" The man blinked, taken aback. "I didn't bring my wallet. We're just here for a wedding." The officer's expression hardened. "Step aside, sir. We'll need to verify your information with the other guests." Helena stepped forward, her voice steady but edged with frustration. "This is out of line. You're treating my family as if they're criminals, with no justification." The lead officer turned to her, clearly unimpressed. "Judge or not, ma'am, you're interfering with an investigation. Step back." Aaron put a hand on Helena's arm, a silent plea to remain calm. "Let's not escalate this further," he whispered. Helena clenched her fists, torn between her instincts to defend her guests and her need to protect them from any further harassment. But as she glanced around at the officers questioning her friends and family, it was clear this wasn't ending anytime soon. Determined to put an end to the harassment, Helena sought out the lead officer as he continued his patrol through the yard. She caught up with him near the edge of the backyard, her heart pounding with indignation. "Officer," she said firmly, drawing his attention, "this is a private event, hosted on private property. I demand to know what grounds you have for treating my guests like this." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Demand? Huh? I don't think you're in a position to make demands, Judge Price." Helena's voice grew sharper. "You're disrupting our event with no clear cause. This isn't how complaints should be handled, and you know that." Unmoved, the officer crossed his arms. "A complaint's been filed. We're here to ensure there's no illegal activity. Now, if you'd stop interfering, we can get on with our work." Aaron joined them, his tone as measured as ever. "Look, we're willing to cooperate, but we're simply asking for some respect for our guests." The officer sneered. "Respect? That's rich coming from folks who seem to think their status makes them untouchable." Helena felt a wave of frustration rise. "You're not here to investigate a crime. You're here to make a spectacle, and we won't tolerate it." The officer took a step closer, his posture growing more menacing. "Careful, ma'am. Keep pushing, and I might have to do more than just question your guests." Aaron's hand moved to Helena's shoulder, a grounding force. "We're not backing down, But we'll handle this together, he murmured. Helena nodded, steeling herself for whatever came next. She was beginning to realize that this night was going to test everything she believed in. As Helena and Aaron returned to the heart of the yard, it became apparent that the officers were growing bolder in their approach. The flashing lights from the squad cars cast eerie shadows, illuminating the scene with a sense of looming danger. Helena's father, a quiet man who rarely spoke out, watched with mounting discomfort as a young officer approached his wife. "Ma'am, step over here," the officer ordered, gesturing for Helena's mother to follow him away from the crowd. Helena's father intervened, his voice steady but filled with warning. "You don't need to speak to her like that. We've done nothing wrong." The officer narrowed his eyes. "Step aside, sir, or you'll be escorted off the property." Aaron's patience wore thin as he watched more officers moving through the crowd, now targeting the younger guests with intrusive searches. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Enough. You're crossing the line here. These are family and friends, and you're treating them like suspects." The lead officer sneered. "Funny, coming from an FBI agent. You should know better than anyone that cooperation keeps things simple." Aaron's expression hardened. "Cooperation doesn't mean rolling over when my family is being mistreated." One officer began patting down a teenage boy who had come with his parents, his hands visibly shaking. The boy looked over at Aaron, wide-eyed and frightened. Aaron's protective instincts kicked in. "Hey," Aaron said, his voice rising. "That's enough. You don't need to do this." The officer ignored him, continuing the search, and Helena felt her pulse quicken. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a clear abuse of power. She moved closer to Aaron, her jaw set. "We need to stand firm," she whispered. "But we need to keep our heads, too." Aaron nodded, his gaze fixed on the officers. "I just won't stand by and let them bully our family." The breaking point came when Helena and Aaron's united stance became too much for the officers to tolerate. The lead officer, his patience evidently spent, strode up to them, his face a mask of authority. "You've been warned," he said, his tone final. "Either stop interfering, or you'll be taken into custody." Helena drew herself up, standing tall. "If standing up for our rights is a crime, then go ahead. But we're not going to watch you trample over our guest's dignity." Without another word, the officer signaled to his subordinates. Two officers stepped forward, grabbing Aaron's arms and forcing them behind his back. "What are you doing?" a guest cried out as the crowd watched in horror. Helena moved forward, reaching for Aaron, but an officer blocked her path. "Ma'am, you're under arrest too," he said, gripping her arm. Helena didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. "This is a violation of our rights. You can't do this." The officer ignored her protests, twisting her arms behind her back and fastening the cuffs. Aaron met her eyes, his expression calm despite the fury in his gaze. "We'll fight this, Helena," he murmured, his voice steady. "They won't get away with it." Guests looked on, some murmuring words of support, others too stunned to speak. Helena's mother watched, a hand pressed to her mouth in disbelief, as her daughter and son-in-law were led toward the squad cars, their once peaceful gathering now overshadowed by the harsh reality of unchecked power. As Helena felt the cold metal of the cuffs bite into her wrists, she cast one last look over her guests, her loved ones. They had been celebrating unity, but tonight, that unity had been challenged in the most brutal way. And in that moment, as she was pushed into the police car, she vowed silently that they would not let this injustice go unanswered. As Helena and Aaron sat, handcuffed and subdued near the squad cars, their guests faced an atmosphere thick with fear. The police officers had split them into small groups, questioning them as if they were suspects rather than family and friends celebrating a wedding. Children huddled close to their parents, clutching at their sleeves as officers cast suspicious glances their way. One elderly relative tried to reason with an officer. "Please, this is all just a misunderstanding. This is our family. No one here is causing trouble." The officer ignored her, moving on to the next guest. A mother hugged her two children close, whispering calming words to them as they whimpered, glancing fearfully at the uniformed figures looming nearby. Helena watched this unfold, her heart sinking. She could see the quiet terror etched on her guests' faces, the confusion and the anger. She struggled against her cuffs, whispering fiercely to Aaron, "They're treating everyone like criminals, like they're dangerous." Aaron looked back at her, his face a mask of controlled rage. "They're sending a message, Helena. They want us to know they're in charge." He let out a frustrated breath. "They don't realize who they're dealing with yet. But they will." After what felt like hours, Helena saw her opportunity when the lead officer approached her again. She straightened up, her voice carrying an edge of defiance. "Officer," she called out, her tone calm but resolute. "I'm Helena Price, a sitting judge. This is beyond acceptable conduct, and you know it. You're stepping on rights and violating laws left and right." The officer smirked. "Judge Price, you think your title puts you above the law?" He leaned closer. "This is how we maintain order when people get out of hand." Helena's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm demanding lawful treatment for everyone here. This is a private gathering, and we've complied with every regulation. You have no grounds for this kind of harassment." One of the guests, a friend of Helena's who had been documenting the incident on his phone, raised his voice in support. "That's right, and it's all on video. You can't intimidate us into silence." Helena looked at her friend, nodding her thanks, before turning her steely gaze back on the officer. "Every moment you continue this is another violation. I'm encouraging everyone here to document this, because I assure you, justice will be served." The lead officer's expression darkened, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Helena's words were spreading through the crowd, and others began lifting their phones, recording the officer's every move. As the officers continued their intimidation tactics, Aaron, still restrained, saw an officer roughly patting down a teenage boy nearby. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear as he glanced nervously at his family. "Hey!" Aaron's voice cut through the night, sharp and commanding. "You're searching a kid with no probable cause. He's done nothing wrong." The officer glanced up, meeting Aaron's furious gaze. "You'd do well to mind your own business, Agent Brooks," he sneered. "Just because you wear a badge doesn't mean you're exempt from consequences." Aaron's voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "I know exactly what that badge means, and it doesn't mean trampling over innocent people." The officer's grip tightened on the boy's arm, ignoring Aaron's protest. At that moment, something inside Aaron snapped. He pushed himself to his feet, struggling against his restraints, his protective instincts overpowering his composure. "Enough!" he shouted. "You're crossing every line, and you know it." The officer turned his back, brushing off Aaron's words, but the scene had intensified the resolve of the guests around them. Murmurs of support grew, with people speaking out against the officer's treatment. The tension in the air was thick, charged with an undercurrent of anger and defiance. Just a few houses away, Agnes Hathaway stood at her window, her face pressed against the glass as she took in the chaos she had unknowingly set into motion. What had started as a simple complaint about noise had escalated into a scene far beyond her intentions. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't anticipated the officers responding with such aggression, nor did she foresee the terrified faces of the children or the anguish in Helena's eyes as she defended her guests. A pang of regret twisted in her stomach, and she clutched the edge of the curtain, torn between her resentment and an unsettling guilt. "Maybe," she muttered to herself, shaking her head, "maybe I went too far." Watching the night unfold, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she had misjudged the situation. These were good people, members of her own community. She saw the officer's treatment as increasingly harsh, and each minute weighed heavier on her conscience. Agnes pulled back from the window, whispering softly, "This wasn't what I intended." She took a deep breath, a glint of determination sparking in her eyes. There might be something she could do to right this, but the time wasn't now. As the night continued, she retreated from her window, her thoughts filled with the cries of children and the cold fury in Helena's eyes. She had started this, but she realized it was far from over. The seed of regret had been planted, and she knew she would have to face her own part in this unfolding storm. Helena and Aaron sat in silence in their living room, the morning sun casting harsh light over the events of the previous night. The house felt different now, its warmth overshadowed by a newfound sense of vulnerability. Aaron nursed a bruised wrist, while Helena's mind raced with the scenes of her friends and family harassed and detained by those sworn to uphold the law. Helena broke the silence. "We can't let them get away with this." Aaron nodded, his jaw set. "They crossed every line, Helena. They didn't just disrespect us. They violated our rights and treated our guests like criminals." Helena took a deep breath, her voice steady but laced with determination. "I've spent my career defending justice. But this is personal now. We need to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Aaron met her gaze. "Let's fight this together, then. We'll gather evidence, testimonies. We're not going down without a battle." In that shared resolve, they found a renewed purpose. They would stand up, not only for themselves but for everyone who had been wronged. Helena and Aaron spent the next few days reaching out to contacts, civil rights lawyers, activists, and friends in the legal community who had fought similar battles. In a conference room filled with passionate advocates, they outlined the events of that night, their words underscored by the anger and hurt still raw in their hearts. One of the lawyers, Sarah, leaned forward. "This isn't just a case of overstepping authority. What you're describing sounds like targeted harassment, fueled by prejudice." Helena nodded. "Exactly. We need to bring this to light, to show the public what really happened." Aaron added, "And we need to push for accountability, not just for the officers who were there that night, but for a system that allowed this to happen." Sarah tapped her pen on the table thoughtfully. "We'll need witnesses, as many as possible. Video evidence, too, if any of your guests recorded the incident." Helena looked at Aaron, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Our guests were already filming by the end of the night. I think we can make a compelling case." The room buzzed with newfound energy, each ally pledging their support. Together, they would transform this case into a movement for justice. A few blocks away, Agnes Hathaway sat alone in her dimly lit living room, haunted by memories of the night she had unwittingly unleashed. Her intentions had been misguided, but the outcome had been far worse than she ever imagined. She'd seen the news reports, the outrage flooding social media. People were calling for justice, and Agnes felt the weight of her own guilt. After much hesitation, she picked up the phone and dialed Helena's number. It rang several times before Helena answered, her voice tired but guarded. "Judge Price speaking." Agnes's voice trembled. "Helena, it's Agnes Hathaway. I need to talk to you." There was a pause on the other end. "Agnes? I called the police that night," Agnes confessed, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought they'd just ask you to keep it down. I didn't know they would." She choked on her words, the guilt crashing over her. Helena's voice softened, though it still held a note of wariness. "Agnes, do you understand what your call led to?" "I do," Agnes whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I want to make it right. I'll testify. I'll tell everyone what I saw. I owe you that much." Helena's voice steadied. "Thank you, Agnes. Your testimony could make a difference. If you're willing to stand with us, we'll welcome your help." Agnes hung up, feeling a weight lifted, yet knowing she still had much to atone for. She would face the consequences of her actions, and in doing so, perhaps find a path to redemption. A few days later, Helena and Aaron sat in their lawyer's office, surrounded by evidence, witness statements, and recorded footage of the night's events. Sarah reviewed the documents, nodding as she took in the strength of their case. "This is powerful," she said, looking at Helena and Aaron. "With Agnes's testimony and the video evidence, we have a strong foundation. But you'll both need to be prepared. They'll try to discredit you, Helena, paint you as a judge with a vendetta." Helena's eyes flashed with determination. "They can try, but I know the law, and I know my rights. This isn't about a personal vendetta. This is about standing up to abuse." Aaron placed a hand on her shoulder. "And I'll be right there with you, every step of the way." Their lawyer looked at them, a hint of pride in her eyes. "This case could be a landmark for civil rights in our city. You're both incredibly brave for doing this." Helena took a deep breath. "It's not just for us. It's for everyone who's ever been silenced, mistreated, or ignored. If we don't stand up now, it'll keep happening." The scene was set, their resolve unshaken. Together, they prepared to step into the courtroom, ready to confront those who had wronged them and to demand justice on behalf of everyone who had suffered in silence. In this chapter, the foundation of their legal battle takes shape, leading naturally to the climactic trial in the next chapter. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation, packed with supporters, members of the press, and curious onlookers. Helena and Aaron stood in front of the large, imposing courtroom doors, taking a steadying breath before stepping inside. As they entered, a hush fell over the crowd. Sarah, their lawyer, approached them, her face calm and resolute. Today, we present the truth. Be yourselves, tell your story. That's what they need to hear. Helena nodded, gripping Aaron's hand tightly. They took their seats, and moments later, the judge called the court to order. The lead officer from that fateful night sat across from them, his face a mask of indifference. Helena felt a surge of anger, but she steadied herself. This was about justice, not vengeance. When it was Helena's turn to testify, she took the stand, her voice clear as she recounted the events of that night. "I am not just a judge," she said, her gaze fixed on the jury. "I am a wife, a friend, a neighbor. That night, our rights were trampled. My guests were treated as criminals without cause. And it happened because those meant to protect us chose to ignore our humanity." Her words rang through the courtroom, resonating with the silent crowd. As she continued, Helena felt the weight of her responsibility, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. After Helena finished her testimony, a murmur swept through the room as Agnes Hathaway, the neighbor who had made the initial call, took the stand. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto the edge of the witness box. Helena watched her, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. Agnes cleared her throat, her voice shaky but determined. "I made a mistake," she began, her gaze flitting briefly to Helena. "When I called the police that night, I thought I was protecting my neighborhood. But I saw what happened, and I realized I had been wrong." The courtroom was silent as Agnes described her regret and her shock at the police response. "I watched from my window as they tore apart a beautiful night. I saw families frightened, children in tears, and I knew this wasn't right. I am here today because I want to take responsibility for my actions and to make it clear that what happened wasn't just." Agnes's confession added a new layer to the case, revealing the extent of the prejudice and corruption underlying the night's events. Her testimony left the jury visibly shaken. The trial concluded after days of powerful testimonies, and the courtroom held its breath as the jury returned with the verdict. Helena and Aaron sat hand in hand, their faces resolute but tense. The jury foreman stood, his voice steady. "In the case of Price versus the city, we find in favor of the plaintiffs." A wave of relief and triumph surged through the room. Supporters erupted in applause, and Helena felt tears prick her eyes as Aaron pulled her into a quiet embrace. This was not just their victory. It was a victory for everyone who had endured similar injustices. Outside, the press gathered to document the outcome. Reporters pressed forward, asking Helena and Aaron how they felt, what their next steps would be. Helena took a deep breath, facing the cameras with a calm, unshakable resolve. "This verdict is a reminder that no one is above the law. We stood up because we had to, because we couldn't look away. But this is just the beginning. We will continue to fight for change, to ensure no family, no community ever faces what we did." Back in their backyard, surrounded by friends and family once again, Helena and Aaron felt a renewed peace as they hosted a quiet celebration. The garden was filled with laughter and joy, a stark contrast to the terror they had endured. It felt like healing, a reclaiming of the space that had been marred by that unforgettable night. Helena looked around, her heart swelling with gratitude as she caught glimpses of familiar faces, some of whom had taken the stand, others who had stood by them in solidarity. Aaron wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his voice warm. "We did it, Helena. Not just for us, but for everyone who needed to see that justice can be won." She smiled, leaning into him. "This is just the start. There's more to change, more to fight for. But tonight, we celebrate what we've accomplished." They clinked glasses, surrounded by their community, their strength bolstered by the knowledge that they had made a difference. The battle had been long, and the wounds would take time to heal, but Helena and Aaron knew they would face whatever came next, together. The future looked brighter, not because their struggle had ended, but because they had turned it into a force for good. And as they laughed with friends under the same lights that once witnessed injustice, they knew they had truly begun to reclaim their lives.